Now, ladies and gentlemen, we know that the rivalry between the Quebec Nordiques and Montreal Canadiens is probably the greatest of all time. But you makes a wonder, why did Game 6, the big brawl that they had in their 84 playoff series, get so out of hand? Well, just a little bit of background. Anton Stastny and Craig Ludwig had a little battle, a set to, before the weird start happened. And I think what really a lot of people don't realize, it only takes one spark to set it off. Now, Steve Penny obviously was a net for Montreal that game. Dan Bouchard, who in 1982 said that God told him or pre-designed he was going to beat the Montreal Canadiens in that series. But you look at the two coaches, Jacques Lemaire, former Montreal Canadian, a lot of pride. Ludwig, Michel Bergeron for the Nordiques, whose ego was sky high after being Montreal in '84. Now you had Mark Hunter and Dale Hunter, their brothers. Dale, the Pissmeyer with the Nordiques. Mark, the up-and-coming Pissmeyer for Montreal. And all of it put together, you had up-and-coming young players from Quebec, very tough. You had the three Stashnys from Quebec. You had Goulet. You had Guy Lafleur. You had Steve Shutt from Montreal. A lot of veteran pride, and it all came together at the end. Now, the major brawl that occurred, there was two of them. One at the end of the second period and one at the start of the third period. Really, everybody should have been thrown out of the game. There was maybe at least 10 or 13 fights, and you had even the backup goalies getting into it. Clint Malarchuk and Richard Sevigny. Ironically, Richard Sevigny eventually ended up with the Nordiques a couple of years later, or actually next year when he beat Quebec Montreal in the playoffs. But you look at the flow of the play, and I'm watching the game in the background now. At the end of the second period, it was pretty chippy. There was a lot of slashing. There was a lot of hitting, the old Quebec style of hitting the Habs into the Montreal boards, whatever they. But where it really occurred, there was an end of period kind of battle after some very chippy play in the last few minutes of the period. Now, there's different versions on YouTube. There's a shortened version which takes out a lot of the third period where Montreal scored those 5 straight goals. But there's an extended version if you can get through all the ads. I think at one point my buddy watched that game, the YouTube version. He said there was an ad every 4 minutes. So if you can put through that. But you look at the great announcing of Bob Cole and Mickey Redmond and Dick Irvin. You look at the old form. There's a lot of goals in this game. Now, ironically, this 1984 contest hasn't really been broken down as much as it should have. I've done podcasts on it before. But why I'm bringing this up today, there's kind of a tradition in Canada when people come off a holiday or on a holiday, they'll go into the old hockey games, the old Vancouver Canuck, Edmonton Oilers, Maple Leaf games, and you watch them kind of with their children or grandchildren to let them know what hockey was like. I give you an example. Somebody told me last night, there's a new rivalry between Toronto and Montreal just because last night was 6-5. There's a few, lead changes or whatever. Nothing will compare to the Quebec-Montreal rivalry of that era because they had come in 1979 to Nordiques, trying to find their way. First season was kind of a rough one. By 82 came around to knock off the Montreal Canadiens, who were 3 years away from being a 4-time Stanley Cup winner. It really solidified the franchise. And when the franchise started going downhill, because basically they lost to Montreal in key playoffs in 87 and 93, really the Nordiques would live as long as they were be able to beat the Montreal Canadiens for something big. But Daniel Bouchard, for the first 2 periods, he was Daniel Bouchard, like the revised one, the revival Daniel Bouchard. He played good. But the third period, he really choked her out. And I'm going to end this podcast saying there's a very key reporter who covered the 82 game asking, why do you think that God chose you over the Montreal Canadiens? In 84, he asked the same question. Well, where was God tonight, Danielle? And he basically hemmed and hawed. But this is kind of weird. Montreal Canadiens, Quebec Nordiques had skilled players and had unskilled players that year, and that's what he fought. He came off like a senior hockey game in the North Shore where a fight could break out at any moment, and that's what it was. So if you like what we're doing here with our Montreal podcast, let us know.